Hello, this is Elvi from Comic Book Bin, filling you in since 2002. Today we're going to be looking at how the Army build a G.I. Joe classified collection. We're going to be focusing on G.I. Joe and Cobra. In order to build that army, we're going to be obviously looking at classified action figures, but also Palaverse, Action Force action figures, Marvel Legends, and a few other lines such as Foosh. With this, we have all we need to start a beautiful G.I. Joe classified army building collection. In a subsequent video, I'm going to be looking at the Joes, but right now, after a few generic notes on both themes, I'm going to be looking at Cobra. Rebuilding has always been very popular, but when we were kids, we could only get one or two at most of each figures. Not many parents were willing to buy more. As collectors grew and are now adults, they like to get more, especially when it comes to troopers. Now, Cobra has always had a lot of troopers, and there's a decent amount of troops also on the G.I. Joe side. Even though most of the characters are named characters, but on the Cobra side, we could say that there's the entire Viper Legion of experts and specialists that we can look at. First thing, when we start army building, we need to be aware of budget and personal limits in terms of space. If you don't have a lot of space, don't army build. If you have a limited budget, don't army build. So this is up to you. Make up and decide how you can go about this. The other thing, let's get over the prejudices against army building. Are you a hoarder or a collector? It depends. Some people will army build with 50 different samples of the same figure, leave them in boxes. Some people will display everything. I display everything. I don't have 50 of the same thing. I've got at least 20 to 25 of some of those army build figures that I try to customize as much as possible. So is this hoarding or is this collecting? You're trying to recreate a world. Eventually, you're trying to create a diorama of all these characters fighting one another. That's the ultimate dream of army builders. For now, because of space concerns, you don't have a whole basement, you have a huge table where you can put all those characters. You just display them, but it doesn't mean that it's hoarding. You're just having fun. There are worse things to collect, worse things to be hooked on in the world than action figures. So just enjoy your collecting. And some people might even say that you're hoarding everything and you don't leave enough for the other people. Well, there's always action figures on the pegs. Companies like Hasbro don't sell everything. They have to discount them. And discounting is actually one of the ways of getting a lot of troops for cheaper and start army building. So there are strategies to this. Now that we've gotten over the shame that some people do feel about army building, let's have fun. Of course, when I army build, the total number of characters that I've got does not represent the whole Cobra army or the whole G.I. Joe army. It's just a sample from a population. So if I've got 3 Televipers, those 3 Televipers represent probably 300 Televipers. If I've got 2 Frag Vipers, they probably represent 200 Frag Vipers, and so on. So for me, having 3, 5, or 10 of each only represents a sample of a population. That's how I picture them. And as I will mention later, and you'll see, some of those guys don't have to be around all at once. Some could be plants, some could be in some other bases, and so on. So you never really have the whole total army at once. So those 3, 4, 10 characters that you're buying only represent a sample of your population. One of the biggest drawbacks of army building is that you don't know what's coming up next with Hasbro or other vendors. For example, when I got the Snow Serpents, I got a deluxe version of the Snow Serpent action figures, which came with the wolf hides and more weapons, bazooka, missile, and so on. A year later, Hasbro released the retro version of the Snow Serpent, which came with less, was cheaper, and was easier for army build. The first version of the Snow Serpent sold out very quickly. It's very difficult to find them, versus the retro version, which had been gone on sale a few times since they were released in the fall 2024. So what do we do? Second example would be the Cobra Eels. The original Cobra Eel that were released in the summer of 2023 sold out pretty quickly. They were barely announced on Amazon that they were sold out. Even though I ordered a few of them, I never got mine. I had to wait for the retro version of the Cobra Eels. Now, as it concerned with the Cobra Eels, Hasbro made very slight changes to them, very slight change in the red and the grays, and one equipment's color, the handle was changed from red to blue. That's it. If you look at those retro eel, they're much like the original ones that were sold with Amazon. In this case, it was okay not to have the original army building made sense with the retro version, which is practically the same. Another figure that you need to watch out for would be the Televipers. Now, I only got two Televipers of the original one and one Python Patrol Televiper with the trouble bubbles. I only got this. In my ideal army, there would be more Televipers, take care of communications and systems, computers, and so on. But I had to limit that, hoping that there would be a retro version of the Televiper. And now there is one that was announced. So I can get the regular Televipers that will come in the retro line instead, and army build those instead. It's going to be much cheaper than getting triple bubbles. The triple bubbles also take a lot more space, so it makes sense to wait for the retro version. But this is how Hasbro has been doing it for a while. If you understand how Hasbro is playing the game with G.I. Joe Classified, it's easier for you to plan ahead. But we never know, because we can't predict in advance what Hasbro will release or not. That's one of the drawbacks of army building. If you're afraid of something becoming rare, you stock up right now, but you don't know that it's going to be re-released later at a different price point. It's a chance. Well, that's what collecting action figures is about anyway. You're taking a chance with everything. Now, in terms of strategy, let's look at either the Joes or Cobras. Collecting and army building them is not exactly the same. I mentioned that most of the Joes are named characters. Most of the Cobra legions, obviously, are Viper legions, and it's easier to army build them. They usually sell more also. The first G.I. Joe army builder that was released in the classified line was the Red Ninja. But at the time, everything was brand new. We did not know what was the future of the line, if there were going to be more ninjas. Who would have guessed that there were going to be blue ninjas a few years later? They sold out pretty quickly, and remaining stock was very difficult to find, but the Red Ninjas remain. The next thing was the Cobra exclusive Viper Island Cobra Trooper. Now, these were very difficult to find, and they were exclusive army builders that could only be found at Target. Many collectors were pissed about that. The line was so new, and we did not know if Hasbro was ever going to re-release them or not. Thankfully, they re-released the Cobra Infantry just a few months later, and those were the ideal Cobra Troopers for people who missed out on the Cobra Island Troopers. They were almost the same, less gear, less weapons. A few details in terms of the coloring was not the same hue. The coloring of the uniform had slightly different shades, and they did not wear the armband. But besides that, they were the same figures. Now, those allow people to splurge on them. In my case, I got 21 to 22 of those guys because I wanted to army build. I could only get 2 Cobra Island Troopers, but I got 21 to 22 of the original classified infantry, which were practically the same. So I had 2 squad leaders and a bunch of troops. That was perfect for me. What's your ideal number when you army build? It depends on what troops you go for. Well, that's how I do it. In my case, I have this internal logic, which is different for every collector. But in my case, I look at what are the function of those troops. Is this a specialist like an Ali Viper, which is a shock troop, or a SWAT type of trooper? Or is this something more generic, more plentiful, like a Cobra Trooper or Cobra Infantry? For me, it influences how many of each am I going to get. For example, the SAW Viper. The SAW Viper is a heavy machine gunner. I'm only going to get 2 of them versus the recently released Retro Cobra Troopers. I've got 27 of those guys. There's a lot more of those Cobra Troopers than SAW Vipers. SAW Vipers are experts. They are very narrow experts for me, larger, squadish type of expert, medium range expert, and very wide release experts. For example, I've already said that I've got 27 Retro Cobra Troopers. I've got 21 to 22. I need to check exactly what the number is of the original Cobra Infantry, coupled with my 2 extra Cobra Island Troopers. So there's a lot more of those guys than there are, say, Ali Vipers. I only got 4 Ali Vipers. I never got more Ali Vipers than that. Why? Because they're an expert shock troop. We don't need as many Ali Vipers as there are for Cobra Troopers. The training for an Ali Viper is also much more difficult than it is for a regular Cobra Trooper who starts at the base. What about the Vipers? The Cobra Vipers, there's a few more of them. They are less Vipers than they are Cobra Troopers. In general, for me, they're infantry, but for me, they're also Marines. So we want them to be Marines. There are a lot of Marines, but less than the regular generic entry-level Cobra Trooper. To be a Viper, you need to have done something extra and be able to land on a beach. That's what their function is. They're like Marines, more plentiful than most troopers, but still not to the same extent. Another generic type of trooper that I've got a lot of, well, I want to get more Televipers. You need them everywhere, in the grounds, in your base, everywhere. You need Televipers everywhere. You need communication and computer experts everywhere. The other ones that I've got a lot of are the Techno Vipers. The Techno Vipers are mechanics. They're also engineers and technicians that go on Cobra battlefields, but they're also at the Cobra bases. So they're everywhere. So you need a little bit more of those mechanics, of those engineers everywhere, perhaps even more than you need televipers, unless your televipers also pilot drones. But these are what I would call the plentiful numbers of Cobra troops, less than generic Cobra infantry and troopers, less than Cobra Vipers, but more than, say, an Ali Viper. So the middle ground for me for the smaller numbers would be an Ali Viper. Only got 4 Ali Vipers, you've got 4 Snow Serpents, I've got 4 Cobra Eels. I don't need any more than that. That's my base number for a specialized squad that is plentiful, but not enormously plentiful. When I go with 2, we're dealing with small number experts like the Frag Vipers or the Saw Vipers. The Frag Viper is a grenadier, so there are not many of those guys. Same thing for the Saw Vipers, the heavy machine gunners. There's a few of them. Not everybody is put out to be a Saw Viper or a Frag Viper. Now, in between those numbers, I've got the Crimson Guards. The Crimson Guards have a different job at Cobra. They infiltrate everything, society. So technically, there should be a lot of them. And I do have a lot of them too. Well, a lot. I've got about 8 of those guys. So they're specialists. They're accountants, lawyers, engineers, teachers, professors, scientists, lobbyists. They're your neighbor. They live on the same street with you. But you don't know that they're Crimson Guards until their time has come to work on an operation for Cobra. So they're plants and they're everywhere. I could get more of those Crimson Guards, but technically they never all show up at once at the Cobra headquarters or Cobra bases. There's a rotation of those guys. They're everywhere in the Americas, in Europe. They're everywhere, those Cobras. So you'll never have to have all of them at once in the base because they're planted everywhere and you don't know when a cell is going to be called upon by Cobra to act. So I have a lot of them on hand, but not to the same extent, obviously, as Cobra Troopers or Vipers. But I do have a lot more of them than I do have Ali Vipers or even Techno Vipers. The one army builder that I've got a lot of are the Cobra Bats. Now, in the world of G.I. Joe, you could think that the Cobra Bats are a bit expensive to produce, but I would think that once Cobra got the hang of it, or Destro, I should say, got the hang of creating Cobra Bats, that it would be cheaper for them to produce them. They're mass-produced and very expensive troopers, but maybe they don't cost as much as training one person or recruit one person. It's probably cheaper for them to release bats, and we already know that bats are released when everything goes bad. That's when we release the bats. They can clean up the field, and the troops can get away. So each of my specific Cobra branches, like the Crimson Guards, the Destro Iron Grenadier, each one of them have bats, but not to the same extent. Now, in terms of generic bats, those I've got more. I don't know how many of them, but probably around 8 to 10. In terms of Cobra, the other branch that I've got a lot of are the ninjas. Now, I've got 3 red ninjas, 3 male blue ninjas, 3 female blue ninjas. That's a lot of ninjas. Most of them come from the Arashikage family or something related to that. I've got a lot of those ninjas. Again, maybe just like the Crimson troops, they're not all deployed at once. For me, the red ninjas are the real Arashikage. The blue ninjas come from different branches and are more generic and lesser trained. Finally, we have the Night Creepers. Night Creepers, I've bought a lot of those because they're contractors or mercenaries, and they could be a lot of them, just like the French Legion. So there are a lot of Night Creepers. I've got 6 of them. That's a decent amount of, and they can be called upon at any time. So they rotate. They don't have to be active all at once at Cobra stations and so on. So that's why I've got 6 of those guys. I perceive the blue ninjas as Cobra's attempt to train their own ninjas in-house using a few red ninjas and other characters like Slice and Dice or even Storm Shadow to train their own ninjas in-house. So the red ninjas are a bit more select, rarer. The blue ninjas, there are more of them, but they're not as effective as the red ones. In another video, I'm going to go back to the G.I. Joe army building team. Today was Cobra. Let's look at the G.I. Joes in the next video. There is something I need to mention. The way that I organize my army building is my way of doing it. It's not the only way, the universal way. There's some kind of logic to it, but it doesn't have to be yours. You can do whatever you want with your own collection. I've decided to organize my army building this way. You don't have to do what I'm doing right now. It's up to you. In fact, I'm quite curious about what strategy you're using to army build. Is it similar? Is it different? Or is it something I've completely not thought of? If you have any tricks, put them down below in the comments. This is Ari from Comic Book Ben, filling you in since 2002. Like and subscribe.